Yeah. So, Susan, you're back in the Emmy race this year for your documentary Spielberg, which is about director Steven Spielberg. It seems like a pretty obvious question about, why would you want to make a documentary about the most influential filmmaker possibly ever? But I wonder what about his story or about his filmography appealed to you as a filmmaker and made you want to devote years of your life to telling his story?
Well, I've always been a fan. And I felt that Stephen, as respected and admired and as important and influential as he is, I don't felt he really got the recognition for being what I call a personal filmmaker. I felt that people think of Stephen as the most successful, the most commercial, the blockbuster filmmaker, and yes, he also did Schindler's List. And I felt it was. It's not that I felt it was. I didn't make this film as a kind of apologia. I'm interested in that connection between the life and the work, and those are the kinds of films that I make. And I wanted to find Stephen in those films that he's made, and to show that he's. I mean, I wouldn't call he's not an autobiographical filmmaker, but that his choices are very personal to him. And so I wanted to track that in this film, and I focused only on him as a director, not as a producer, an executive producer, a TV mogul, DreamWorks, none of that, just as a director. And that, that's what I wanted to do. If I had thought about it very much, that I was making a film about the most influential, famous filmmaker and important filmmaker in the world, I probably would have, if I'd focused on that too much, I probably wouldn't have done it. But it was a challenge for me, and I like him personally a great deal. And so I did it. And then I literally never thought about, is he going to like it? What does it mean? And I just put that out of my head completely, or I probably would have been frozen. You know how that can happen. I don't know what to do.
Well, he's also somebody who, as famous and as prominent as he is, he's not talked a great deal about his work, in many documentaries. So I wonder, I mean, when you first approached him.
He has not. He's never done a director's commentary on any of the DVD releases. He has never participated in any book about him. There has been only one other film. I mean, there have been there have been films that he's been involved with, like on the making of Jaws or the making of Close Encounters, that kind of thing. But any kind of biographical film, he's never participated. He's never done an interview for any book. He's been pretty silent on the subject of himself. So, and I think that's one of the biggest surprises for people on this film, is how open he is. And we had a good time. I did 30 hours of interviews with him for this film. I did 15 two-hour interviews, which is kind of remarkable for somebody as busy as he is. He's never just doing one thing. He's always doing 40 things. And to make that kind of time for this was a real gift. And clearly, once he got in. I mean, listen, neither one of us ever thought there were going to be 15 interviews. If I had asked at the beginning of this, I'm going to need 15 interviews, I don't think interview number one would have happened. I never said that. We started, and at the end of the first 2 hours, he was like 14 years old and just got the camera, and he said, "God, this was fun. When are we doing it again?" And that is kind of the way it went, until finally it was like, "Do you think you have enough now?" And I had, we knew we were done. The only thing that he asked, there was nothing off limits. The only thing he asked is that we proceed chronologically, and I didn't always observe that. I did at the beginning, and I understood why, because he's a really busy guy. He's working on, as it becomes clear in the film, he's making one film, he's editing the other, and he's in development on the next 10, working on scripts and, all these. He's very multitasking guy. So for him to know 2 days before, oh, I'm going to be seeing Susan, We talked about this last time. We're going to be talking about this next. Helped him organize his thoughts and to be prepared. After a while, we kind of blew that off, and because it's a pretty thematically oriented film, but we did by and large go chronologically.
I actually wanted to ask you about the structure of the film, because I remember going to the premiere, and right out in the beginning, you start off with Jaws, and I said, well, wait a second, where's everything else that preceded that? But you mentioned it being thematically ordered. Can you explain a bit what you mean by that, and how you did structure this film?
Well, I had a lot of different openings on this film. I mean, I did not. From day one, I knew I was going to start with Lawrence of Arabia. That I knew. The minute he told me that story, I said, I'm going to start the film with Lawrence of Arabia, because it said everything to me. It said right at the top, it says, he wanted to be a certain kind of filmmaker. And that's the filmmaker he became. He didn't want to be John Cassavetes. He wanted to be David Lean. And it's such a good story, because it's about what sets you on a path. And that movie set him on a path. He said that was it. I knew there was no going back after he decided he couldn't possibly ever do this, because he could never be that good. But I had then a whole bunch of early life, and, until I got to Jaws, I thought at first I have to get to Jaws. I have to understand what it took him to get to Jaws. And then I went, oh God, everybody's saying, just go right to Jaws. Because that's what people want to see. And I didn't want people to turn it off, But more importantly, when I decided to start after Lawrence of Arabia with him saying, I'm scared every time I start a movie, but it's a good thing that I am, because the more boxed into a corner I am, the better I am as a director. And the bigger challenge I have to overcome, the better I am. And I thought, what's the biggest challenge he had at the very first movie? It was Jaws. I mean, you couldn't have had more challenges. So it kind of happened ultimately organically. Thematically, when I say thematically, I mean, I think there are themes, and the themes of childhood, outsiderness, broken families, father-son difficulties. These are themes that I think are prominent in almost all of his movies. I could not believe the consistency of it myself. I kind of knew it, but when I really started exploring it, it was like, oh my goodness, this is almost at every movie. There is some part of this. And then the anti-Semitism, the effect of outsiderness and anti-Semitism on him, which I think culminates in Schindler's List, and a final acceptance of him as a serious filmmaker. After that, the story changes, and that was one of the hardest things I had to deal with. How do I come out of Schindler's List, and because he's a different filmmaker after that. He's a family man. He takes the responsibility of being the most famous and successful filmmaker in the world seriously. And the things he became interested in changed. I still think the broken family thing will always be there for him. And the coming together, the breaking up and the coming together. But it doesn't necessarily have to be about families anymore. As I said, in Lincoln, it's about the nation coming together. But he's a different filmmaker after Schindler's List, and how to make those things come together was a real challenge, because it's a very personal story up to Schindler's List. And after that, it's a filmmaker, elder statesman. How am I going to use my influence now to make films about things I think are important, and still not lose the boyhood wonder that goes into something like Jurassic Park?
Right. You do cover a lot of ground in this movie, and for people like myself who could have watched hours and hours and hours of it. So I wonder, was there anything that you had to leave out that you were particularly heartbroken about?
There were many things I had to leave out. In fact, I had to take an hour out of the film. It was initially going to be 2 nights. And then, for a variety of reasons, we all began to feel like, how are we going to bring an audience back for night 2 after Schindler's List, which night 1 ended with Schindler's List. It seemed so complete, such an emotional experience. He'd gone from this boyhood wonder to making one of the greatest films about one of the most difficult subjects in the world, and he finally gets his Oscar. How are you going to bring him back? And I was very wed to certain things that I didn't want to lose. But then I showed it to some filmmakers, friends, other documentary filmmakers. We do that in the documentary community. We share and we learn. And one person said, which was one of the kinds of things that you could miss. He said, "You never actually said what Schindler did." And I realized that I had left out, he saved 1,100 Jews. Oh, okay. But one person said, you know, if you don't see night 1, you might not understand night 2. Because there are things that play out and resolve in part 2 that are set up in part 1. And that was it. I said, you know what? I need to make this a 1-night experience. And so I had to take an hour out of the film. The thing that I most hated losing was Stephen talked to me about how he had always wanted to be one of those workhorse studio directors from the 40s. Those were the guys he most admired. You know, the William Wylers and the Howard Hawks and the John Hustons, and, you know, those guys. And Hitchcock to some degree, even though I think Hitchcock is another category.
Right.
A totally other category. So I'd take him out of that. And Preston Sturges, those guys who could, well, again, Preston Sturges is his own kind of thing too, but who could make a Western, and the next month they're making a romance, and the next time they're making a war movie. He wanted to be that kind of filmmaker. And I had a whole section on that, and how he referenced John Ford, you know, how he referenced those, and how you find these little sneaky things in his movies where he's paying homage to these directors, and how he really did finally create for himself that environment. He said he could, that those guys had a team, and that team was always there. They were the same people, the same set designer, the same, you know, and that they kind of got a rhythm going, and he ultimately created that for himself, and he really became that kind of director that he'd wanted to be. And it was a really wonderful section, and I hated losing that. I hated losing AI. Oh. AI was an outlier in the thematic approach that I was making in this film. It was an outlier. I never could figure out how to do it. And I did have a whole thing about his fascination with Pinocchio, and which is something that recurs in many of his films. And again, the parent-child idyllic childhood that he had hoped to have plays out there. And I did work hard on that, but even that isn't something that ever actually did make it into. If I'd had 4 hours or 5 hours or whatever, I probably still could have done that. But there were still elements of Stephen's story that I couldn't fit into this 2.5 hours.
Well, you do cover a lot of ground. I want to ask you about your upcoming movie, which is about Jane Fonda. It's called Jane Fonda in 5 Acts. That premieres September 28th. Another really fascinating, 24th?
September 24th.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. It said 28th on the Internet Movie Database. So 24th, people, don't trust IMDb. Trust Susan Lacy. Another fascinating figure who came about in the same time as Steven Spielberg. Tell us about what attracted you to Jane Fonda's life.
Well, I'm a woman, and she's fascinating, and her life has been fascinating. I read her book, My Life So Far, about 17 years ago, and I was struck by it then. I was struck by how honest she was, and what a frankly difficult journey she had gone through in her life. I mean, it's not a movie star life, and I didn't want to make a film about a movie star. I wanted to make a film about a woman who'd gone through a lot of stuff to get to where she is today, who had an understanding that if she didn't explore her past, she would not know how to go forward and how to live, as she says, the third act. The notion of acts, people always ask me, why did you do Jane Fonda in 5 acts? And I think it was so logical to me. She sets up the notion of 3 acts in her book. And I needed to understand the first 2 in order to understand how to live the third act. So, and she's also very honest about that so much of her life was lived and influenced and in every way by 4 men, her father and her 3 husbands. So getting to Jane, the whole authentic Jane, it just was very logical to me. But I felt that her story had a universality, and she says it even in her book, that she wrote the book. There were 2 reasons she wrote the book. One was to speak to her daughter, with whom she had a complicated and a somewhat, at that time, a strange relationship. But the other thing she said is she felt that if Jane Fonda, who had lived the life of a privileged Hollywood royalty, could experience what she experienced with emotionally unavailable father, a mother, well, I don't want to give too much away, but a lifelong struggle with the fact that she did not bond with her mother, therefore was unable to bond with her first child, bulimia, unfaithful husbands, and we could go on, that there was an aspect to her story that would touch many, many people. And that's what she says, that's why she wrote the book. And I'm sure that's what touched me when I read her story. And that's the film I wanted to make. And I felt that it would, so it's not a film about a movie star. It's a film about a woman who kind of finally reaches a place where she's able to be herself. And she says, I'm a work in progress. She doesn't think she's there yet.
Right. I mean, I think it's fascinating because, for people in my generation, we just have seen Jane Fonda as a feminist icon, and because when I saw the title in 5 acts, you think, okay, well, this is a woman who's gone through so many transformations. What those 5 acts could be, there's a different variety. So it was really striking when you see that it's about these men in her life and how she got to be that feminist icon,
And yes, and she came to feminism late.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that ultimately I didn't include in the film because of time limitations, but and the way it was structured, it got a little bit confusing. But she, when she was with Ted, and she began to be a feminist while she was with Ted. But prior to that, when she was, in the anti-war movement and economic equality and, all those things she was fighting for, she thought feminism was a distraction from the real issues. It took her a while to get there. And when she did get there, wow, she's there 300% now, and she is a feminist icon. But it's interesting that it wasn't a factor in her life until she was married to Ted. She was, in her 50s.
Right.
She was 60 when she left Ted.
Right.
And that's when she started this journey of discovery and learning about her mother and trying to understand her life.
Talking to Jane Fonda, what were some, I guess, similarities or differences between, was it more or less difficult to get her to open up about her life than it was, say, Steven Spielberg? Or what were some of the challenges of getting her to talk about her life?
Well, she's a very different person than Steven, who isn't used to talking about his life. As we said, he's never done this before. I mean, he was even surprised at how revealing he was. He has many more layers of privacy. And Jane, having written the book, was very comfortable telling her story. It wasn't difficult at all to get her to open up. We had really good conversations. The thing that is the most important in any of these interviews, and to be able to make the kind of films that I make, is there has to be enormous trust between the person that you're making the film about and the person who's making the film. Without that, you don't get anywhere. And that's one of the reasons that I do so many interviews, because you build that up, you build a level of trust and comfort, and that it becomes a conversation and not an interview. And that's what happened with Stephen. That's what happened with Jane too. So I didn't find it difficult at all. That doesn't mean that I didn't have some surprises. And even though I read the book, there's a difference between reading it and somebody talking to you, and they know that they kind of hopefully forget it, but that millions of people are going to see it. There is a difference between talking about your mother slitting her throat, and writing about it than talking about it. And she'd never done that on camera. Maybe a little bit. She's done a fair amount of talk shows, but not in this kind of depth. Nothing in this kind of depth. So I think one of the things that surprised me that somehow I missed in the book was that she didn't own the workout tape, that was owned by the organization that she and Tom had founded, and that all the profits, and it's of course still #1 best-selling video of all time. So that's a lot of money. So she did eventually get it back, but not until fairly recently.
No.
I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it did. I didn't know that about the workout tape either. So, Susan, thank you so much. Congratulations on your Emmy nomination for Spielberg. I'm sure we'll be talking this time next year about Jane Fonda in 5 Acts, which you should watch on September 24th. Thank you again for your time.
On HBO.
On HBO, yes.
Thank you so much. I would appreciate it. All right, bye-bye.